Old King Jaehaerys is often hailed as one of the greatest kings in the Targaryen dynasty and of Westeros as a whole. But despite being such a revered king in the history books and having brought on prosperity to the realm, the Old King was not immune to having fears of his own. One of his biggest fears was the realm being torn apart after his death. Despite siring many children in his lifetime, most of them would either end up dead, disinherited, or uninterested in their father's throne altogether. Two of his most important children were his two eldest sons, Aemon and Balon. Aemon was the king's oldest son and his heir apparent, but when he died, instead of naming his eldest son's only daughter and child as his heir, he instead named his second son, Balon the Brave, as heir to the Iron Throne. Because throughout the entirety of Jaehaerys' reign, despite the grievances brought to him by the women in his life, like his wife Alysanne, his sister Jocelyn, and his granddaughter Rhaenys, the old king thoroughly and firmly believed that no matter what, a son came before a daughter. And since Aemon had sired no sons of his own, his younger brother would have to do. Balon was well loved, and from how history tells it, Balon the Brave might have made a fine king one day. But the gods give as they take away. With the death of Balon, the succession became rather tricky, though it seemed clear who the new heir was, given that Jaehaerys very much preferred male inheritance, and Balon, unlike his older brother, left behind not one, but two sons. The old king feared what could happen depending on who he made his heir. Rhaenys, in her youth, had not been happy with being replaced by her uncle, and one could only speculate what could happen if she was passed over again in favor of a cousin. She had a legitimate claim to the Iron Throne. She was a dragon rider, and now she was allied with one of the most powerful houses in the realm through her marriage to Corlys Velaryon. She also had heirs of her own now, who may have dragons for their own one day. Who knows how they might feel about being robbed of their potential inheritance. But they weren't the only concern. Viserys and Daemon, their father was the heir before either of them, named by the old king himself. Who knows how they might feel if he chose Rhaenys over them, when they were the direct descendants of the last heir. This resulted in one of the most defining moments in Westeros, which really set the precedence for male inheritance, the Great Council of 101. Here, the claims of both Viserys and Rhaenys were put against each other. At least they were in the show. In the books, it was Viserys' claim versus Rhaenys' son, Laenor. And this caused a divide not only within the Targaryen family, but with the Velaryons as well. Years later, Rhaenys was even still upset about the outcome of the Great Council, and so was her husband. Corlys believes that they were robbed, and at every chance he gets, he tries to get his family close with the royals. Eventually, they both get over this though, Rhaenys much faster than Corlys, but it doesn't change the fact that this was very important and easily could have become the dance before the dance. If these two people with very valid claims had a different mindset, things could have been very different. And different is something we do very well on this channel. You see, marriage is a very vital thing in Westeros. It gets you friends, allies, resources, and in some cases it even gives strength to your right to an inheritance. This was also the case with Rhaenyra and Daemon. Despite having a pre-existing attraction to one another already, Rhaenyra believed that marrying Daemon would add strength to her claim to the Iron Throne. This was also why she wanted to marry Jace to Helaena. By marrying her son to Alicent's daughter, it would give his claim to the throne more legitimacy, especially since he was a bastard. Marriage can be quite the unifier and problem solver in Westeros. So, what if the old king decided to capitalize on that a bit more? What if instead of Rhaenys and Viserys' claims being put against one another, they were brought together? What if the House of the Dragon was never divided all those years ago between the royal family and the Velaryons? What if Rhaenys and Viserys were married? So, before the Targaryen family was ever split between the Greens and the Blacks, it was already split between the Velaryons and the ruling family of Westeros. Though despite this divide and the dissatisfaction with how the Great Council turned out, and each side having dragons of their own, the families stayed on relatively good terms with one another, and no war was ever fought despite each family having a valid claim to the throne. But, as I stated before, what if those claims were brought together? Eventually, this does happen in canon through Rhaenyra's marriage to Laenor, even though the Strong Boys aren't his. Then there's Daemon's marriage to Laena and their daughters being betrothed to Rhaenyra's sons. The bloodline of Balon and Aemon, Viserys, and Rhaenys do come together, but that's only after so many years and a lot of politics. But what if we cut out the middleman altogether, and that happened much sooner through Viserys and Rhaenys? For this to work though, we need to go way back, to a time before the Great Council, before the deaths of Balon and Aemon and the Old King. The reason for this being because both Viserys and Rhaenys got married pretty early on in their lives. Rhaenys got married to Corlys when she was around 16 years old. Viserys also got married to Aemma around that age, but it's important to note that Rhaenys is actually 3 years older than Viserys. So 3 years went by before he married, and by that point Rhaenys was already with Corlys. So for this match to work, we'll have to spin the clock back a few years before Viserys ever gets with Aemma and before Rhaenys gets with Corlys. Perhaps sometime when they're still kids, maybe in their early teenage years or a little bit earlier. These two cousins marrying each other honestly isn't that far-fetched of an idea because of how close in age they are. There's only a 3-year difference, and considering cousin-to-cousin marriage, it's pretty normal in Westeros as a whole. Not that it would matter if they were brother and sister to begin with. If they were, they probably would have been married much sooner, but let's move on. We'll say that at some point Aemon and Balon, or maybe even just Jaehaerys, decide to marry Viserys and Rhaenys when they're still young because they don't have any brothers or sisters respectively to marry themselves. And Jaehaerys may be a bit more selfish when it comes to Targaryen might in this timeline. He doesn't want Rhaenys to possibly marry outside of the family and create another house of would-be dragon riders that could threaten them one day. The idea of there being dragons and riders outside of Targaryen control is not appealing. So Rhaenys and Viserys are engaged. And later on, when they are of age, they are wed. And this wouldn't be the first time Jaehaerys has tried something like this, where he's tried putting two potential claimants together through marriage. Before his son Aemon, his oldest child was actually a daughter named Daenerys, and his wife Alysanne believed that since Daenerys was the oldest child, then she should be heir to the Iron Throne. But Jaehaerys dodged this by saying that she could rule beside Aemon when they were both older and were wed. His favoritism towards their son did not make Alysanne happy, and this marriage pact wasn't even able to come to fruition because, when Daenerys was a kid, she got sick with the shivers and died, leaving Aemon the rightful heir if not by gender, then by age. I don't see this new marriage pact causing too many issues with either Viserys or Rhaenys, because one is Targaryen custom to marry within the family, and two, in the show, they do seem to get along rather well even after Viserys was chosen over her. So I imagine they would be a happy couple, especially considering how much Rhaenys loved Corlys despite his antics, and how much Viserys loved Aemma even though he killed her. He cherished her even after she was gone, to the detriment of the rest of his family, but still, he cherished her. I believe a marriage to Rhaenys could end up helping Viserys out a bit. He was always rather indecisive and wasn't the quickest to action. Rhaenys could help him with that. Since he's not as prideful as Corlys, he may be more accepting of a push or two from his wife. But I do believe while there may not be any troubles for them starting out, the real conflict would come when their fathers die. When Aemon dies, if Rhaenys is still passed over in favor of Balon, this could cause issues within the marriage, because if Balon was propelled ahead of her, then so was Viserys. As his son, he's heir after him, and depending on how much Viserys loves Rhaenys and how he feels about inheriting the Iron Throne after his father, he may try to help her convince Jaehaerys to change his mind. Maybe even try to get his father to talk to the Old King as well. Viserys never really struck me as a man who wanted the Iron Throne. It's more so that it was stuck on him and he couldn't do anything about it. So he rolled with the punches because it was his duty.
But you've refused me at every turn.
That is because I do not wish to get married.
Even I do not exist above tradition and duty, Rhaenyra.
Then, assuming that Balon dies from a burst belly like he did in canon, I imagine Viserys will remain the uncontested heir in this timeline. There won't be any Great Council happening here. The main reason the Great Council was called in the first place is because the claims of Viserys and Rhaenys were independent of one another, and each one was valid in its own right. The Old King was afraid that with his decision, a civil war might break out. It's one thing for a cousin to fight a cousin, a nephew to fight an uncle, or a brother to fight a sister. But for a husband to fight a wife, that's different, especially if they have kids together. That would be one nasty divorce settlement. So with the knowledge that Rhaenys and Viserys most likely wouldn't tear their marriage apart for the Iron Throne, Jaehaerys makes his decision final, and Viserys rolls with it because that's his duty. Rhaenys may try to fight it, but she may not have much support since she's married to Viserys in this timeline, and people still prefer men to women. She also doesn't have those same allies as she did in canon, and as I mentioned before, she probably won't want to tear her family apart just to sit on a chair. We saw in canon just how much she really cared for her family, her children. So while there may be tension in the marriage because of this, I do believe Rhaenys will accept it, even if it's reluctant. So when Jaehaerys dies, Viserys ascends as the first of his name, and with Rhaenys as his consort and queen. History changes forever, but not just with these two, and it is not small. Entire characters and plot lines just get erased with a match like this. Like Corlys. He never marries Rhaenys. All the dragons stay within the Targaryen family. Laena and Laenor also cease to exist, and by extension, so do Baela and Rhaena, as well as the Strong Boys, since Rhaenyra will never have to marry Laenor and have a need to get with Harwin Strong to produce heirs. Not only that, Rhaenyra also ceases to exist because the genes of Aemma and Viserys will never come together since they aren't married. And if they aren't married, who does Aemma get with? Or does she just stay a bachelorette in the Vale? I highly doubt that, especially if the Jaehaerys of this timeline didn't want any stray Targaryens out there on the continent giving more houses dragon blood. I'd say in this timeline, instead of marrying Viserys, Aemma actually gets married to Daemon. And I imagine the Rogue Prince may not have any objections to this. Maybe he'd prefer someone like Rhaenyra and Laena, who have a bit more fire to them. But I don't see him complaining much, since this won't be like his marriage to Rhea Royce. He won't be forced to play second fiddle, sent away to be someone else's consort, with no real standing away from home. This could also mean that since Daemon has a match he may like more, he has children much earlier than he did in canon. Speaking of which, by the time Rhaenys and Viserys ascend as king and queen of the Seven Kingdoms, they would most likely have children of their own, especially considering they both did have children before the Great Council of 101 in the first place. And as we see in canon, both Rhaenys and Viserys had no issues producing children. Rhaenys had 2 and Viserys had 5, though he only really cared about 1.
My
So with this knowledge in mind, there probably won't be an issue with them producing heirs to the Iron Throne. I imagine they would probably have 3 children to start out with before they actually took the Iron Throne. The oldest being a boy named Aemon after Rhaenys' father, a daughter named Alyssa after Viserys' mother who died after giving birth, and another boy named Aegon. As for Daemon and Aemma, I imagine since both of them had girls first, they also had a daughter together in this timeline, who we'll say is named Arya, after the niece of old King Jaehaerys, who at a very young age claimed the dragon Balerion, who took her on a ride to old Valyria, which later resulted in her death once they came back. But speaking of death, that is something I do not see in the cards for Aemma in this timeline. Since her husband is a prince and not a king, and he's down there in succession thanks to Rhaenys and Viserys having children of their own, there won't be much pressure on her to produce heirs like there were when she was with Viserys. She won't have to conceive again and again and put all that strain on her body. This may even mean that if things go well, she gets to live longer. And because she doesn't have all that strain on her body, she may have an easier time delivering more children should that be in the cards for her and Daemon. If that does happen, then it's very likely that at some point the children of Daemon and Aemma will marry the children of Viserys and Rhaenys, which could unify the heads of the dragon. Honestly, I don't see a dance breaking out in this timeline. Assuming that no one gets overzealous or Rhaenys dies and Viserys has to get a new wife and her family tries to change the succession, there would still be conflicts, most definitely, but we could still have a more peaceful timeline in my eyes, and perhaps the dance is put off for a future generation. It's simple, but those are my thoughts. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, tell me what you thought in the comments, and I will see you all next time.